just, that reminds me that Jesus is alive, and not only he's a king, but, he really cares about us in that relationship. So I am going to kick off by starting with a review. Do you guys remember what Julius talked about last week? He went over the 4 cardinal virtues. Do you guys remember what those virtues are? I don't have the chat open, so if you could just speak up, that would be awesome. Anybody, anytime.
Prudence, fortitude, justice, and temperance.
Awesome. That sounded like Shinji. Was that Shinji?
Yeah, it was.
Perfect. Do you guys remember what prudence is? Who's got that one? That one's hard because when I was in high school, like prudence seemed like prude, and prude was derogatory. So I was like, oh, is that what prudence is? But anyway, I see Steve smiling, like he understands what I'm saying. I see John smiling. That's not what prudence means in that context. Does anyone think they know or remember? Even Julius, because you gave the message. Maybe I'll test you. What's prudence?
Prudence is knowing that there's a cause and effect, that what I do will have an outcome, and knowing and making a decision based off of that.
Yeah, it's perfect. Exactly it. Steve, you wouldn't happen to have the slides, would you?
Yeah, I do. I can pull them up for you.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Thank you.
Give me a sec.
Thanks, sir. Next slide. And then, so that's the 4 cardinal virtues, just like you said. And then I'm going to kind of just hone in on prudence, which to me is just another way of saying wisdom or knowledge, just because that's kind of been the journey that I was on this week. Next slide, please. So where C.S. Lewis and Pastor seem to have gotten those 4 cardinal virtues from is from 2 Peter 1, verse 5 through 11, right? And it says, for this very reason, make every effort to add to your faith goodness, and to goodness knowledge, and knowledge self-control, and self-control perseverance. So perseverance you would know as something like fortitude, right? And self-control you would know as temperance, right? And then obviously knowledge as prudence. And then if you do these things, you will never stumble, right? And you'll receive a rich welcome into the eternal kingdom of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. It's a couple of things that I think I have to remind myself of as I'm exploring what it looks like to, I guess, grow in prudence or grow in knowledge, that to remember that the purpose of this is to add to my faith, right? So knowledge increases my faith, but it doesn't substitute for it, right? And that's a big thing that I have to hash out for myself. I personally try to gain knowledge to substitute my faith, right? I feel like the more knowledge I gain, the more I'll know God and the closer I'll be to God. And that's not what it's saying, right? What it is saying, and why Peter does say this, is in verse 16. Next slide, please. So it says, for we did not cleverly devise myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty, right? So he's saying you want to increase your faith, right? And knowledge increases his faith, but he didn't make up these myths about Jesus. These things are true. Now, the realization of what he's saying, if I take the Bible at face value, is he's calling me to believe something very supernatural, right? That there's a Jesus Christ. He was a real person, and they eyewitnessed his majesty, right? Which means that he ascended to the heavens. So then to believe in Jesus, I have to really believe these supernatural things, right? Can I get the next slide, please? So for me to believe in Jesus of the Bible and take on this supernatural worldview, I'm believing a man can be born of a virgin, I'm believing a man can heal blind people and make paralyzed people walk. I'm believing in angels and demons. I'm believing in dead people rising. And I'm believing Jesus himself is God, right? And that he resurrected from the dead and he ascended to heaven. These are the things I'm claiming to believe. If I believe in Jesus, this is the faith I'm trying to increase by knowledge. But that's the key word, right? Knowledge. But my current understanding of knowledge and the way I study in school and in life has nothing to do with the supernatural, right? Or at least I don't see that it does. So the reality is when I'm called to believe in something like this, next slide, Steve. That's how I feel. I feel like in order to believe these kinds of things, I'm like a Neanderthal. I got to believe in ancient ideas and superstitions, right? And the problem with that, right? And the reason why I'm willing to do that is something I've learned as a kid, which is, next slide. If I don't believe, I'm going to hell, right? So this is something I've learned as a kid. Like, I got to believe these supernatural things, because if I don't, I'm going to go into hellfire. So then what do? Next slide. The reality is I bury it inside of me, the doubt. I don't face the doubt. I don't face my current understanding of how the world works and how it seems to contradict what the Bible says. And because I don't want to go to hell, but I do feel like a Neanderthal, I kind of bury that feeling inside of me, right? And I cover on top of it all these quotations from the Bible and these things that I'll pile on as far as understanding goes. But the reality is the guy still lives in me. And next slide, Steve. He'll pop back up. And when does he pop back up? He pops back up when I'm called to share my faith. So when I meet an unbeliever and I feel something tugging inside of me like, hey, I think something inside me really wants to explain what the gospel is to them, right? Because if the gospel is good news and Jesus is true and he's real, then I should share him with this guy so he doesn't die in hell, right? This is what we believe. Or when my faith is tested through hardships, right? If I'm going through something like no money, or if I'm fighting with my wife or my kids, that's a hardship. And how come I don't recall the truths of the Bible in that moment, right? And the reality is because I've buried doubt in my heart. I buried a doubt of my own belief of what the Bible is saying, and I've covered it up. Now, psychologically, right? Next slide, please. I've mentioned this before in messages, but this is called cognitive dissonance, right? There's two terms that I really kind of just took out of my schooling. One of them was cognitive blind spots, where you're so focused on something you don't see other things, right? The other one's cognitive dissonance, which is basically when you believe something, but the way you behave doesn't line up with that belief, right? So then what happens when you act in a way that doesn't line up with your belief, you feel something uneasy in your head. And as human beings, we like to feel level. We don't like to feel uneasy. So then we'll do something called belief confirmation, which is we'll either engage in denial of what we heard or what we believed, and we'll do something called we resort in selective exposure, or we ignore the information that distorts our belief system, right? So when I learn something in school like evolution, right, or the idea that the world is billions of years old, and that's the whole reason we can have Earth's crust and the ocean, right? And then it starts to kind of conflict with what I think I know about the Bible, I receive dissonance. And because I'm scared of hell, I don't face that dissonance, I ignore it and I bury it. And the problem with burying it is when I'm actually called to live out my faith, I can't do it well because I'm hiding. And I know in my own experience in just martial arts, I mean, my expertise is in training people in jiu-jitsu. And I know when people hide from the truths of where they're at in that sport, it pops up when they hit something, a hardship. So for example, what I mean by that is whenever I teach someone jiu-jitsu who's never done jiu-jitsu before, their first reaction, anybody, is always to go for a headlock, right? And it's, as someone who understands jiu-jitsu, it's probably one of the worst things you can do, because if you headlock somebody, you're exposing your back to them. right? And for early students, I think what's even worse for them is if they go for a headlock and they reach success from it, right? Because now in their mind, what they're going to do is every time a grappling match happens or they get in a fight, they're going to go for the headlock. And that's going to be a big problem when they deal with someone who can, I guess, really, who knows how to beat the headlock, right? And so if I'm training somebody, they have to unlearn that desire to go for the headlock. And it's even worse if they found success from that headlock, if they want to grow and get better. And that's kind of what's been happening in my own Christian walk, right? What happened was I found success early on by burying my dissonance, right? By not facing the truth. And it gave me a lot of success in my walk with God up until a point that's basically now, when I'm hitting real difficulties beyond my ability to ignore the truth, or at least face my fears of what the truth is. And now I'm in this season where I have to go back to the beginning and deconstruct the parts of me that I ignored, the parts of my foundations that have cracks in it that I wasn't willing to look at. So then the reality of that for me then is I, as a thinking, or I like to think of myself as a person who thinks well about things, I have to realize, oh, there's a dissonance in me on what I feel about Genesis 1 through 3. I have a problem in my heart ever since I was a kid about the story of creation. I have a problem in my heart ever since I was a kid about the story of Adam and Eve and the fruit. And then because that's part of the foundation of my belief and my dissonance, if I don't face that, I have a big problem. Especially because, next slide, Steve. Just a reminder, like, to believe in Jesus is to believe in a supernatural worldview, right? That a man could be born of a virgin and to rise from the dead, and Jesus is God. And someone in my life that you guys are all familiar with is Pastor. And Pastor's a doctor, or he was a practicing medical doctor, right? So for him, when he was early on in faith, his biggest problem was, how can a man be born of a virgin, right? Like, he couldn't get past that. So for him, it was hard for him to believe the rest of the Bible. And then he came up with something that made a lot of sense to him logically and kind of helped his walk. Next slide. For him, he had to realize that if Genesis 1 is true, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, that there's a God and he created the heavens and the earth, of course he could make a baby come from a virgin, right? So he just had to ground his faith in the beginning, the truth. And for me, there's a lot of validity in that. So then I wanted to explore, okay, do I believe in the beginning God, first off? And if I believe that, do I believe he created the heavens and the earth? Okay, so then next slide, I'm going to introduce you to something. This is the Council of Elrond. Okay, this is in The Lord of the Rings. What happens is when they discover that the ring could be something terrible, the elves, the dwarves, and the humans, they all get together and they all try to decide the fate of the ring, right? If I were to be honest about myself, the truth is this is what's going on in my head all the time. I call it the Council of Elrond. All these voices are in my head talking about like decisions and ideas that I'm trying to make. And I realized there's a big problem in my council that's popping up in my life. So for example, I fought with Jamie this week, right? I had some ideas about what she was doing, and I summoned the council in my head before I brought them up to her, right? And I'm hearing these accusations in the council of what's going on. And finally, in my mind, I come to a conclusion. It's important for me to tell her these things, right? And then a fight erupts from that. And I realized the biggest problem about my personal council in my mind is I'm the loudest voice in that council. And so when I summon the council in my mind to come up with a decision, I'm listening to myself speak the most. And that's a big problem because I shouldn't be the smartest person in my head because I'm not the smartest person in the world, right? Ultimately, I want God to be that voice. But before I even get there, before I even get to God, why not have smarter people than me, wiser people than me be that voice? And that's a concept that when you guys enter college, if you guys decide to enter college, you're going to want to learn when you write your papers. Next slide. In your college writing course, you're probably going to be exposed to a book called They Say, I Say, right? And it's a way to do scholastic writing. Basically, you're going to listen closely to what other people are saying about the subject that you're writing about, right? Because ideas don't come in a vacuum. And you're going to see ways you can enter that discussion. But it's mainly about what other people are saying about it, right? And that's the way you want to approach your writing. And that's the way I think I want to approach my thinking as I do life, right? I don't want to be the loudest voice in my council. I want to hear what people have to say that have been through these situations before. I want them to have a discussion in my mind about what they are and whether I put those things on paper or not so I can see them clearly, so I can live life a little more wisely. That's the way I want to at least try to approach my thinking and how I apply those thoughts to my life. So then another thing came up as I'm kind of going through these things that was in the book that I realized is very important. It's very important that I understand the critic, right? So whatever idea I have to give the critic a voice, because internally that critic is in me as well. He's that Neanderthal guy, right? And if I don't give him a voice, if I don't clearly hear what he has to say, if I just bury it, then I won't really get to the fundamental truth of what I believe. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's, sorry, next slide. I was doing too much of the talking, that's me. And then, so why go through all this trouble, right? Because there's fundamental answers that I need, there's fundamental questions that I need answers to if I'm gonna do life. I need to know in this lifetime for myself, is there a God, right? If there is a God, why is there evil and suffering? What is the point of life? I wanna know that. That's something troubling to my soul. What will happen after I die? Because death is a reality. And how should I live my life, right? If there's a God, and where should I seek those answers, and how can I believe it? These are questions that will always be in me, and it's just part of the journey, and I want to know where I can find these answers. So next slide. So I go back to the beginning, like Sound of Music so eloquently describes. Next slide. And the beginning for me is a sandwich. It's a sandwich of creation, the Adam and Eve story, and Cain and Abel. Adam and Eve being in the center of that story, right? So I realized that something about the creation narrative and something about Cain and Abel is going to really help me understand the Adam and Eve story, right? That I need to understand the context of those things as the bread so I can get to the meat of what's happening in Adam and Eve, because that's where my dissonance began, right? So next story, next slide. So then my counsel, remember, it's not going to be me. Oh, I'm sorry. Next slide. I'm going to skip that one. Next, the counsel, I'm going to summon the critic. And the critic that I'm going to use is a guy named Jordan Peterson, right? So before I say anything else, I have to really clarify, like, he's not the enemy. He's going to create a lot of doubt in me, right? And he's going to say some things are contradictory to my Christian worldview as I know it in the Bible, but that doesn't make him the enemy. He's actually going to clarify my thinking because he's brilliant, because he's a professor of psychology, that he used to lecture at Harvard. He's a best-selling author. And he did a Bible lecture on what he thought the Bible was about on YouTube, and it got 2 million views. So he's someone who's a voice to a lot of people, right? So because of those reasons, I really wanted to dissect what he had to say about what he thought about what Genesis was, because deep in my heart, I think he articulates what my doubts are and the things that give me dissonance as I think about the supernatural worldview of the Bible, which is what we're addressing. Next slide. So to understand Jordan Peterson, I kind of have to understand the people that he's bringing to the table to make his arguments. He's bringing in, because he is a he's a psychologist, he's going to bring in Freud, and he's going to bring in Nietzsche, and he's going to bring in Dostoevsky, and he's going to bring in Carl Jung, brilliant thinkers, smarter than me. And he's going to make great points about why they think believing in the Bible is, I mean, this is just my paraphrase, but why it's an archaic way to think and why it hinders humanity and why it stifles man's ability to grow, which are doubts that are in me, right? And I want to know what Peterson's position is right off the bat. Like, I don't want to hide from it because he's going to make points that I think in my intellect sound really good and that I might agree with. But ultimately, I have to understand that he doesn't believe in God the way that we believe in him through the Bible. He thinks God is people, human beings over a long period of time trying to figure out what the guiding principle of life is, that we extracted the core of those guiding principles and we turned it into a representation of a pattern of being. That's God, right? And there's a reason why he has to think these things. Can I get the next slide? Next slide after that. I'm going to skip that one. He has to think these things because he says he's scientifically minded, right? That he's rational and he's empirical, and that divinity, which is godliness, can be reduced to biology and evolutionary history, right? So he needs to go off the worldview that the world is 15 billion years old, right? He needs to go off the worldview that 7 million years ago, we split from chimpanzees and human thought emerged 150,000 years ago, right? And the reason I'm even bringing this stuff up is these are things I learned in school. And these are things for sure I imagine you guys are being exposed to in school, these ideas and these thoughts. And it's really smart people talking about these things. And a lot of these things seem coherent about the way the world works and how you see it. So then if we don't have a good understanding of what the fundamentals of what the Bible are saying, these things might create dissonance in our belief. And the reason I say that, because I know it did for me, right? So next slide. So yeah, if that's what I'm going up against, Dostoevsky, Jung, Freud, Nietzsche, Peterson, and then I bring to the table a supernatural worldview, I'm going to feel like that guy. I'm going to feel like the Neanderthal. And that's going to be in my heart when I approach people about my so-called belief system in Jesus and the Bible. That's really what's going on in there. And that's where the dissonance lies. So let's go back to my fundamental questions. Next slide. And what Peterson has to say about those things, right? So when it comes to the question of, is there a God? The scientific-minded, rational person that Peterson represents will think, no, not a real person. He's an abstracted ideal, right? And where should I seek my answers? Rational thinking, biology, and evolution. And he'll get to the conclusion, that's why I put it in blue, that living your life means sacrifice, because sacrifice produces success. And that's the way he interprets what the Bible's message really is. It's these beings that make sacrifices, and then they see that by sacrificing, they produce success. So you think in like agricultural terms of an archaic person, they realize, hey, if I don't eat all of my crops right away, I can save them for the next season. So if the rain doesn't come, I'll have crops then. So sacrifice produces success, as opposed to like their chimpanzee ancestors that will eat everything in front of them and then die the next season because there's a drought. Do you know what I'm saying? Do you see kind of where his logic is going in the emergence of thought? So then these are things that without knowing it, I'm bringing into my thinking of what the Bible is also saying and what God is saying. And that's going to be a problem for me, right? So then realizing that this stuff is going on in my head, that these are some ideas that I might have embraced as well somewhere in my thinking, I wanted to bring that to my counsel, right? That's going on in my mind. And I wanted to bring other great thinkers into the conversation. People that can think better than me, have more access to this material than I do, and have had this conversation before I even got involved in it, right? So next slide, please. Next slide. So we're going to start with the creation narrative of the Bible, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the deep face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So I'm going to stop right there, right before I even said, God said, let there be light. From there, it's like, okay, this is the creation narrative. What's going on, right? how did this align with what I've been learning in school, right? And is there a dissonance here with what other Bible-believing scholars might be thinking? So then, next slide. To the conversation, the first part, I want to bring up a guy named John Walton, right? He's got a PhD from Hebrew Union College. He's someone who people tend to go to as an expert in the Old Testament, right? And especially in ancient Near Eastern literature, which is basically what the Old Testament is, right? And he brings up some certain points that you want to have to the table before I read Genesis, right? That all literature is dependent on the culture in which it arises. It must be if it intends to communicate effectively, right? So a big part of studying the Bible that I'm learning is to study it in context, right? You hear that all the time in Bible study, like what's the context of the passage? But what he's getting at too is not only the context of the passage within the Bible, but what's the context of what's being written in the time that it's being written. Do you know what I mean? You want to know how the people thought about what they are writing about and not bring in your own filters to what they're saying, right? So when you think about Genesis, if we think about the creation example of the creation text, we realize that if God were to reveal his creation in our culture, he'd have to explain it through the Big Bang Theory or evolution, right? Which is not what's happening in the Bible. In ancient world, the physical structure, it was insignificant to them. They didn't care how it was made like we do. For them, they wanted, they were more interested in bringing out the chaos of the divine exercise of jurisdiction demonstrated in giving everything a role and a purpose. So what was more important to the ancient writer was what was the role and purpose of the earth, not so much how it was made. And you want to kind of realize that that's the thinking going on. So then, next slide, please. So with that kind of on the backdrop, I bring in another PhD Hebrew scholar named Michael Heiser, whose podcast has been really helpful to me. He's a Bible-believing Christian, but he's brilliant Hebrew scholar. And he says the same points, like if you interpret the Bible in context, it means interpreting it in the light of the worldview it was produced. So then he goes on to say that when you read Genesis 1 that way, and when you put it up against a lot of the other ancient texts that were there at the time, right, you would see that it does have parallels to Babylonian tales of Marduk and some creation narratives of ancient Egypt and Canaan. So then what the Bible in Genesis 1 is doing is it's a direct attack on the Egyptian creation beliefs. Basically, when God is speaking everything into existence, it's less about, hey, this is how the world was made, and it's more about the theological point that, hey, it wasn't your Egyptian God that created the world. It was our God, right? So it's a theological point that whatever you think, whoever you think made the world, it's not true. It's our God. And you're just bringing in that idea as you go into the next parts of the stories or all the stories that reveal themselves, right? So then, next slide. My point is this, right? So Jordan Peterson, remember, he's reflecting to me what the scientific view of the Bible is. He's going to come to the conclusion that these same Hebrew scholars came to, that when you're reading the Genesis account, it's not people doing science, right? Because science didn't exist back then. So if we try to understand Genesis 1 with our worldview of, oh, we're trying to understand creation as science, and we're trying to make those points, we're going to miss the points that they're trying to make about God, right? So for me, that's important because now, okay, they've all lined up. So now that I'm approaching creation, I'm not going to approach it like, hey, this is something about how it was made scientifically. This is about a deeper point that I need to find through that, right? Next slide. And then next slide. So basically, in a nutshell, what I'm saying is a lot of what Genesis 1 is like the intro to Star Wars, right? It's giving you the backdrop of information you need to understand the story as it reveals itself later. Okay, next slide. So then, okay, what are the points that it's trying to make? that I need to look at, okay? Attributes of God that are important for the story to come. God is the one who created the heavens and the earth. It's not any other gods. When he speaks things into existence. He can say, let there be light, and there's light, not the Egyptian god Ptah, right? He names things, right? So naming things is important to understand in its ancient Near Eastern context. For them, things came into existence when they had a function or a role. So naming things is giving things their function or their role. So when Genesis is talking about God naming things, he's giving things a function. And that's going to help me later on as I approach how he makes man, and he has Adam name things. Oh, when Adam's naming the animals, he's basically giving them their function or their role in the earth. And that's going to help me understand what it's trying to say about God and his relationship to man. So when he separates things, right, he separated light from darkness. It's also saying that, remember, he's separating light from darkness, but he's not abolishing darkness, which darkness has always been a symbol for evil, right? So in the creation narrative already, you can see waters being separated from waters. I talked about that before. Waters has always been a symbol for chaos, that it's still present, but the point is being made that God is in control of it, and he pushed it back, right? So God controls the chaos that's still existent, which is still very helpful for me as I approach the meat of the story, which is Adam and Eve. So next slide, please. So there's more things that, we'll get from God's attributes in the creation narrative, right? That God shares his rule. That's part of the creation narrative. God made the greater light to rule the lesser light, right? So he made one thing to rule another. And God lets his creation participate in creation and duplicate, right? So one thing that I saw that I didn't see before is that in Genesis 1:24, it says, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to its kind. So basically he made the earth to bring forth those creatures. So now what he made is participating in creating things as well, which you'll see he ends up giving that role to humans as well, because God made man in his image. And John Walton, that really smart guy, he points out that when he says image are symbols of his presence to act on behalf of him as representatives, right? So in other words, when he makes man or humans in his image, the image is less about like their material things, but it's more about their function, that their function reflects a royal rule. To when he says fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over it, that's imaging God who ruled and created. He's going to share that role with humans, and he's going to allow that role to basically be taken on by humans. When you see like image and that, I guess that language is really just to show like it helps me in the Genesis narrative as I'm kind of seeing, okay, Adam and Eve in a garden imaging God. It's telling a story about how we were supposed to rule as God had ruled, and what did we kind of do with that? I think it's trying to make that point. So next slide. So it's back to the questions that are so important to me, right? So far in the narrative, is it helping me answer these questions? The fundamental questions I need answer to. Is there a God? According to the Bible so far, yes, one God who created the heavens and the earth. If there is a God, why is there evil and suffering? We haven't quite gotten to that yet because we haven't gotten to Adam and Eve. But one thing we can learn from the Genesis narrative so far is it doesn't say he abolished it when he made the world. Right? He made the world good. He didn't necessarily make it perfect. And what's the point of life? So far, I'm getting it's to image God, act as a ruler in his place over creation, to be his representative. What will happen after I die? We haven't gotten there yet, but we're only in Genesis 1 and 2. How should I live my life as an imager of God? So it's already helping me answer some questions that I have. Next slide. And then next slide. So then now that I'm getting to Adam and Eve, and I'm not going to go beyond this. We don't have the time. I'm actually already out, but you can kind of see just this journey I've been on. There's been these questions since I was 6 years old that's really created problems for me. Like, if God made the tree of knowledge of good and evil, why did God make that tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? Why did he put it in paradise? Why is there a snake? How can snakes talk? Since they didn't die right away, why were their eyes opened? And was the snake telling the truth? And why can't people have the knowledge of good and evil, right? But the reason I couldn't answer these questions when I was 6 was I already had the wrong view of what the first 2 chapters was trying to tell me, right? And these answers, man, I wish I had the time. I ended up finding them through this study. It's been really helping me use knowledge to increase my faith because they're answered as I do a deep, in-depth study. But I guess the reason I'm bringing this up to you guys now is I don't doubt for a second that you guys have the same doubts that I have, especially when you line up your thinking with what school is teaching you. And you guys are smart kids and you guys do well in life. So there's going to be dissonance when you approach ancient Near Eastern literature and it doesn't line up with your current worldview. And what I'm challenging you to think about is there just has to be a deeper Bible study, because ultimately the Bible is true and there is a God and he's real and he's alive and it's supernatural. And the reasons why there's going to be dissonance in what you think the Bible says and what you say, those things can be answered with just a deeper understanding of what's being said and through deep studying, which I hope you get to. So I just wanted to hit one thing before I close about, okay, the question of, in the Garden of Eden, why is there the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? Like, why make that an option? And the best answer that I heard was from a guy named Ravi Zacharias. He's an apologist who passed away recently. But I'm going to read what he had to say about just the creation narrative and what the tree of knowledge of good and evil kind of represents. So there are only 4 possible worlds that scholars have talked about. The first is that there be no created world, right? So one possibility of the world is just have no world. Would it have been better for God to have created no world than to create this one where good and evil are possible? The second is to have a created world where only good would have been chosen, right? So a kind of robotic world. The third option would be a world where there's no such thing as good or evil. You'd call that an amoral world. And the fourth world is the world that we live in, where good and evil exist along with the possibility of choosing either good or evil, right? And as soon as we introduce the question of what would have been better, we again invoke an absolute point of reference, and that we can only introduce if God does exist. If the final analysis of the 4 worlds describes ours, it's the only one where love is genuinely possible, right? So what he's saying is, in the 4 possible worlds that exist, our world, the one we live in with the possibility of good and evil, is the only one where love is possible. So that's going to make a big point about who God is, right? Because we must recognize that love is the supreme ethic that we know of. And where love is possible, freedom and the possibility of suffering accompany it, right? So in his character, God alone is the absolute expression of love that has never separated from holiness. God cannot be at the same time holy and unloving, or loving and unholy. In turning our back upon him, we lose the source of defining love, live with the pain of unholiness, and suffering remains an enigma, right? So in other words, what Ravi is saying is, because we live in a world where we do have the choice of good and evil, and that world exists, that's the only possibility where love can exist. So that makes love the supreme ethic, which, when you unravel the Bible, it is a story about love. And it's a story about God's love, that God is love. And ultimately that love is expressed through Jesus. And when I think carefully about these things, I realize, man, that's so true, that this is the truth. And I have to think carefully about what I've accepted as truth and realize, man, I don't know everything, that I have cognitive blind spots, and that's okay, because knowledge isn't supposed to substitute my faith. It's supposed to increase it. And whether I take a scientific worldview or a biblical worldview, either or will take a leap of faith, right? And the scientific one doesn't lead to love. But in my life, I've already experienced love, and especially God's love. So with all my knowledge, I choose to take the leap of faith that, yeah, Jesus is true. Jesus is real. Jesus is God. He did come to this world, and he did die and rise again, and he is ruling and reigning now. It's true. And the Bible, as I study it deeper, will reveal that truth to me. And until then, yeah, that's where I'm at. So hopefully that was helpful. I know a lot of parts could be confusing, but that's, I think, the journey we all should take if we kind of really want to think clearly about what we believe and where doubt might be rising from. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Ben teacher. I think your discussion leaders have the discussion questions for today. It's actually a great segue from last Friday's youth discussion as well as upcoming Friday's youth discussion. So last Friday, I think Julie's teacher asked you guys to prepare like a prayer journal, something to write notes into, hopefully at the end of Friday discussion. If you guys could actually bring that out for today's discussion as well, I think it'll be very helpful to go back to. The questions he has are, what are some things that are hard for you to believe about the Bible? Second question, what resources do you find truth? And that may be like what you answered last Friday, which is, what are the voices that you listen to, right? Who do you turn to, or what do you turn to as your voice of truth, or opinions that you turn to? And last question, what are some important questions about life you want answers to? And I'm not sure if your discussion leaders shared this with you, but this prayer journal is also great for you to write questions on, right? Honestly ask God, these are the questions that I have, and wait on him. He may answer your questions through maybe even Ben teacher's message today, or another message you may hear, a book you may read, or just life experiences. So wait on God as he wants to answer your questions. He doesn't want to hide himself from you. So I encourage you to write it down so you can look back, to it and see, oh, wow, God answered these questions that I had. Anything else you want to add, Ben teacher?
Yeah, I think just the biggest thing for me was realizing, like, I don't have to defend my Bible, right? Like, people for thousands of years have tried to dismantle it, and people smarter than me, I can ask hard questions, and the Bible will defend itself, because God will defend himself, and the truth will come out. So I'd say don't be afraid to ask those questions. Don't be afraid to explore them. If God is real and he's living and he wants to reveal himself to you, those questions aren't going to beat him. If anything, it's going to increase your faith, because you're going to face them like it's doing for me.
Okay, everyone, have a great discussion, and we'll see you on Friday in person, or online in person.